Hello? Hello? Is this working? You can hear me? Yeah, can I ask everybody to take your seats, please, so that we can start the main session on gender?
Can we all sit down so that we can start our session?
Hello, can we all sit down, please, so that we can start the session? Yes, the gavel is what's... Hello, everybody, and welcome to the main session on gender, which is gender inclusion and the future of the internet. I'm actually going to ask, this is a significant moment for gender and internet governance, because after 10 years, this is the first main session on gender. So I'm actually going to ask that we applaud. Yeah. Thank you. And my name is Bishakha Datta. I live in India and work at a non-profit called Point of View. So I'm from civil society. And my co-moderator.
And I'm Emila Gandhi. I'm Zimbabwean, and I live in South Africa, and I work for Facebook, based in Johannesburg.
So just a little bit about why it's tremendously significant to get a main session on gender. And I'm going to go back to 2010, when the first main session on human rights was held at the Internet Governance Forum. And that led, along with other things, to the recognition of human rights, both offline and online, at the Human Rights Council. So our hope is that with this kind of session, we will be able to signal the importance of integrating gender as a core dimension of internet policy and governance, which has been happening every year at the Global Internet Governance Forum, as well as at regional and national internet governance fora. So with that in mind, we just want to run you through a little bit of how this session is going to be organized. Basically, the session is broken into 4 chunks. The first 3 chunks are what we are calling 1A, B, and C. And yeah, all of these actually relate to key issues and challenges related to gender, human rights, access, internet policy, artificial intelligence, etc. And this will take us the first sort of 1 hour, 15 minutes or so. After that, we switch to the last segment, which looks at gender and internet governance. And we're going to try and actually shift around the way we sort of do the segments a little bit, so that the first 3 segments will have interventions of 3 minutes each from a fantastic lineup of speakers. And then the 4th segment, which is on gender and internet governance, we're going to run more like a talk show. And Emilar and I are going to actually moderate different segments. So we're going to alternate with each other. So with this, let me hand over to Emilar to take it forward.
Thank you, Bishakha. And we don't want to waste a lot of time talking. We do have experienced speakers, expert in their own fields, and they can introduce themselves later on. But before we even start with the speakers, we have David Kay frame the conversation for us and just, and open it, yes, and let us, everyone in the room know, why is this significant? Why should people stay in the room for the next 2 hours? And
okay.
Introduce yourself.
Okay. That's a lot of pressure. Maybe we should shut the doors, lock the doors, because I don't want you to leave while I'm talking, or when anybody else is talking. So I just want to say a few things about this. First of all, I'm David Kay. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. And one of the things that I have been very lucky about over the course of my 3+ years in the mandate has been working with organizations like Bishaka's, like APC, like the many organizations that are working in the space of freedom of expression and gender rights. And I guess I want to say just a couple of things about this. I don't know if I can frame the discussion. That's a heavy burden. But I think there are a couple of points to make. So the first one, and one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have organizations like APC active in this space, is that it's often seen that there are two kinds of issues that are competing in some way. So on the one hand, you have gender-based violence, and then competing with that is freedom of expression. And I think that one of the really brilliant insights that many of the people in this room, and I think people on this panel, have been saying for a long time, and that APC has been really essential at coordinating, is that expression and protection are not independent of one another, and that really the first place to be, the first way to think about these kinds of issues is not in terms of a victim of gender-based violence as purely a victim, but is also an agent in her own right or his own right. Right? That I think is a critical perspective that APC and others have brought to the table. And I hope it's a way that we can think about the issue over the course of this discussion, although I'm leaving, so I say we in the generic sense. So I think that that's the first point that I want to make, is that that gender-based violence and expression, that those don't need to be at odds with one another, that protection and expression can go hand in hand. The second part of that is that as we're thinking about the ways to deal with, in particular, online abuse or online violence, that we need to be really careful in ensuring that the steps that we take, or that we're asking either companies or governments to take, are on the one hand targeted to addressing the real serious threats that are gender-based online, but also don't do so in a way that disproportionately impact the rights that all people enjoy online, and in particular that have a valence that's gender-oriented, let's say. So just to give a couple of examples, generic examples, but examples nonetheless. So one is that in an effort to deal with problems of, let's say, gender-based abuse that takes the form of, say, revenge porn, I think it's important to make sure that policies and rules target that problem and don't give governments the opportunity to target other issues, such as the sharing of information about sexual or reproductive health. And one of the things I think that we've seen all too often is that rules that might have a sound basis and are well-intentioned are often misused by governments to deny rights that have to do with public health, let's say, or sexual health. And so we need to be very careful, and this is an example where the basic rules of freedom of expression, the basic principles of freedom of expression can really help us. And I'll close with that, and maybe this will be my last kind of framing. So Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides that everyone enjoys the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. It's a brilliant formulation in many ways, and if people have heard me say this before, I'm sorry, but it seems, even though the language is actually from about 1948, from the Universal Declaration, it's language that also feels right in the digital age, right? It's regardless of frontiers, and it's through any media. Governments also have the ability to restrict freedom of expression, not opinion, but expression, And they can only do so when they meet 3 conditions. Again, probably everybody in the room knows this, but those conditions are that they're provided by law, that they're necessary and proportionate, and they're targeting a legitimate objective. So to protect, for example, public health or public order or rights or reputations of others. I think that provides us a really good framework, but it also, I think, puts an onus on us to a certain extent to ensure that those who are putting burdens on expression justify that those burdens meet those 3 conditions so that they're provided by law, they're clear, they identify the specific kind of expression that is problematic. They don't provide excessive discretion to governments or companies or other kinds of regulators. Second, they're necessary and proportionate. We shouldn't just rest or allow governments and companies simply to say it's necessary to do this because of X, Y, or Z. We want them to show us why. There needs to be transparency about why a particular restriction is necessary and proportionate. And that proportionality part means, yes, definitely tackle gender-based abuse, but don't use that as a pretext to target other kinds of expression that might be offensive for reasons of public morals or religious bias or something that might be offensive but not within the framework of human rights law. And then finally, ensure that the actual restriction is for a legitimate purpose. And too often we see governments and I think companies adopting restrictions that don't meet at least one of those conditions. So I think that this is an absolutely essential discussion. It's a discussion that I think can be important not just for thinking about gender and online rights, but also can be a discussion that has spillover effect into all sorts of other kinds of expression. And thankfully, because of the people associated with APC and the organization itself, there's a framework for thinking about rights and expression that is sensitive both to the violence and the abuse that's out there, but also to the rights that people have to access information and ideas of all kinds. So thank you, and I apologize that I'm going to speak and run.
Yeah, but before you run, we just want to open this up for maybe 2 questions for you before you run from the floor. Any questions?
All questions were answered. I mean, I see a lot of people in this room who always have a question, so shoot away.
Okay, can I ask you a question, David?
Yes.
Because all questions answered cannot go unanswered. Yeah, the unquestioned, I mean, yeah. No, what I wanted to ask you actually is that I know you have really talked about, freedom of expression, like that when there is gender-based online violence, that itself affects freedom of expression for those who experience gender-based violence online, right? So in that context, how do we get platforms, policymakers, or governance processes to recognize that and sort of, or even laws? How can that be put into practice is something that I wanted to ask you. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's not enough time to get into specifics, and I think the whole discussion will focus on that, which I think is really valuable. But I think there's at least 2 parts of an answer that at least put us on the path to an answer. So one is, I think if we're talking about companies, they need to engage with civil society. I think that the companies, and some have been doing this more and more because of a recognition that they can't make rules in the absence of the actual stakeholders, right? So I think that's important as a process issue, is that people in this room need to be involved in that kind of discussion. And particularly if we're thinking about this space as being almost like public space, if not actually public space. I mean, many of us consider our interactions in social media to be more or less our public space, our interactions, our ability depends on having that kind of access, that if they're going to talk about themselves in terms of a kind of a public function, and if we're going to think of them as providing that space, that should also include making their rules not exactly the way democratically accountable governments do, but also making the rules with a kind of deep, regular input from those who are most affected by those rules. So I think that's important. And then the second part, which is connected, because you can't engage if you don't have information, is that we need to be advocating for maximum transparency, and not just transparency in terms of the rules, but transparency of process, in transparency of cases, of examples of how things are being taken down. So I think those two things together can actually provide a better chance that the specific rules on the merits will be more consistent with what people in this room might think are how those rules should be constructed.
No, thank you so much. We can release you now. If you
Sorry, I got this.
the doors can be unlocked now.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and Bishaka, over to you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next segment, which is looking at key issues and challenges. And we have 3 speakers with us. Our first speaker is Chennai Chair, who's a researcher with Research ICT Africa, which is a non-profit think tank based in Cape Town, South Africa. And Chennai, I wanted to actually ask you a question related to your work and related to the very vital question of access. So what have you seen in terms of the progress made in terms of ensuring that all genders have access to the internet? What are some of the key challenges? And what are we missing in the debate? Are there sort of blind spots that we are not looking at that could really take us to a sort of more meaningful solution? Are there questions, actors, initiatives that are not part of the conversation? And how can IGF facilitate this?
Thank you very much, Bishaka. I thought this was one question, but at least the transcripts will show me that there are like 6 questions in there. But firstly, thank you for having me on this panel. It's actually an honor because the first time I joined IGF, seeing gender sessions, they always seem to be hidden in some back room. On the last day, everyone's gone shopping and you don't know it exists. But to respond to your question, what we have seen in terms of the gender issue is that there have been initiatives and policy-making processes that have focused on ensuring that the issue of gender is addressed, use of research to ensure that there is some mechanism that allows for the gender question to be properly addressed. However, I think the biggest blind spot has been that it seems to have been more of a one-size-fits-all policy. And I know this is perhaps maybe because more of the context in which I'm coming from, the different African countries that I look at, it really has been understanding gender from a very heterosexual perspective, looking at the differences between men and women, but there hasn't been much in terms of looking at the differences amongst women. And so then this morning we had a session, the BPF session, that looked at the different subgroups. And these are just some of the subgroups that we looked at, which were rural women, youth, women from refugee camps, just some of these groups. So I think what's definitely missing is the way in which we approach the gender question. There really definitely needs to be an unpacking of what these forums understand to be a gender question, because when you come to the global IGF, you can have this main gender session and it's all dedicated to gender. When you go to your regional IGF, you'll have gender packed with something else. So once again, it's, I think, when it comes to the access question and priorities of issues, it really has been how do we approach the gender question. So yeah, so that's the groups that have been missing in these conversations. And I think one of your questions also was like, how do we engage more people on the process? So I think for me, the biggest challenge with the question of access has that we've been working in siloed conversations where you find that people working on research are working on their own, people in the tech sector are working on their own to address the gender question, or people in the civil society space are working on their own. So there hasn't been as much crossover as necessary to ensure that the conversation is similar and that there isn't a repetition of work. And I think also it's about evolving the question of access to not simply be about access to resources, but to actually understand what does access mean to the target group that we want to focus on. So for us, we've been trying to coin this topic around meaningful access, where it actually is defined by the groups of people that we're trying to understand. And our research is understanding what is it that you do online, why do you go, why do you access these services, and what do you intend on doing when you get access. I think that's also one way we will then understand why is it that when in cases of gender-based violence or in cases of where people would describe as bad content, we have women or different groups that then decide to not be online. So then we can improve access to get people online, but then what happens when the access that you get is not exactly what you want and then you end up leaving the online space? So that's my intervention.
Thank you very much, Chennai. Our next speaker is Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who's the chief of ITU's Strategic Planning and Membership Department. She's the most senior ranked woman at ITU. And Doreen is also the founder of the GemTech Awards, which recognizes gender and technology. So Doreen, since ITU has been championing the work around access and leadership in the area of gender and ICTs as well, could we hear a little from you about some of the lessons that ITU has learned in this process, some of the insights and what we can bring to bear on the IGF as a result of that?
Thank you very much, Bishaka. It's really a great pleasure to be here. 2017 has been a really important year for the digital gender divide. And as you mentioned, we have succeeded in being a main session here at the IGF. That's big progress. We also succeeded in having a reference in the G20 this year and in the Women's 20. That's big progress. And most recently, we had a whole paragraph included in the ICT for D resolution of the second committee in the General Assembly, so that's great. So what's next? What's our next big challenge? Maybe our next big challenge is to have no more gender sessions because we actually have no more gender gap when we talk about digital. I think that's my hope for the future. I just wanted to touch briefly on the access gap because we know that we still have a gap, that there are, when we look at the gap, it's 12% less women than men that are using the internet. We know that the gap globally is growing. It's growing most in Africa, where more men are getting connected and fewer women. The gap is about 25% fewer women online than men. And we know that when we look at least developed countries, the gap is even bigger, where there's only 1 in 7 women that are using the internet, and this is really a big concern. There is a lack of disaggregated data, and we believe that we can't solve problems that we can't see. So we really do need to address the data gap. We also know that chronic underinvestment in rural areas actually has a disproportionate negative impact on women living in rural areas. But we believe that there are lots of things that we can do. There's lots of solutions. And when I talk about the solutions, I want to mention 3 names: Nela, Kemli, and Roya. And I hope you have all met them. Last night they were here and they were awarded at our Equals in Tech award ceremony. And this morning, just before the Best Practice Forum, they joined us for a panel and they told us their stories. And what I found interesting from their stories, as one of them mentioned, even small initiatives can do big things. These 3 women have done incredible things in their home countries. with very little funding, very little even political support, but they were motivated and they were inspired to make a difference, and they have. Nayla has created the Lebanese Alternative Learning, where she's focusing on Syrian refugees, so it's very much centered around access. And this morning she shared with us some of the challenges that she faced, and I think a lot of us can understand those challenges linked to the digital gender gap. She highlighted some of the social, cultural issues, so it's not just about connectivity, there are lots of other issues that we need to overcome, about how to convince teachers, so getting the message out there, and how to convince educators, the problem with devices and the cost of devices and what she's done, and also the problem with local languages. So I think it was really great that she could share with us some of the work that she's been able to do in Lebanon assisting Syrian refugees. We also heard from Kemli. She's from Costa Rica, and she's created the Sulabatsu Cooperativa. And that's interesting because she's looking at ways to bring women and girls in the technology sector. When we look at the digital gender gap from the ITU, we break it into skills, access, and leadership. So she's taking on the leadership side and really trying to figure out ways to get girls and women interested in ICT, in the ICT sector. So coding for moms, coding for girls, digital skills training to help develop future women entrepreneurs. And then specifically on the skills side, and that's where Roya comes in. She's from Afghanistan. And she is the founder and CEO of the Digital Citizen Fund. And what she has been working on is establishing sustainable economic livelihoods for women and girls in Afghanistan. And she has focused on digital literacy programs and making them very much sustainable and community focused. And what was great to hear from her is that financial literacy was such a driving component, and she was able to overcome a lot of barriers in traditional communities because she showed that by giving them the digital skills, making them financially literate, they were actually able to generate income. She gave an example of a 16-year-old girl that actually had 25 employees. So I know I'm short on time, but I thought it would be good to share with you 3 names, 3 specific cases, 3 amazing women that we awarded here at the IGF and we heard from this morning, because that's how we can really make a difference. And through our Equals partnership, where we're working with civil society, the private sector, governments, and academic institutions, we believe that we can all come together, share experiences, share know-how, and really make a difference on the ground. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Doreen. I just wanted to say that thank you for also reminding us that small initiatives from the ground up can actually sort of have big outcomes or do big things. I think that's a valuable insight that we take away. Our next speaker in this particular segment, which looks more at one of the key issues and challenges, which is access, is Joyce Doniez, who's the Senior Director of Global Engagement at ISOC. And I know you've been doing some work around engaging with SDG 5, Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is the one around gender equality. At the same time, I think ISOC has also shown some interest in working on the issue of gender and mainstreaming gender much more. So Joyce, if you could speak to some of those.
Thank you very much, Risata. As you may know, the fundamental goal of the Internet Society is to bring an open, globally connected, trusted and secure internet for everyone, everywhere. And that includes, obviously, all genders. Now, what we've seen is that the latest Internet Society report that was focusing on the future of the Internet has identified that there's some divide in terms of people. People are divided between hopes and fears regarding the future, but there's also gender divide. And so we know that there are 200 million fewer women online than men. And We heard some figures already, but in the developing world, women are 25% less likely than men to have access. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, those numbers jump up. Now, one of the discussions we had at WTDC, amongst others, is that technology in and of itself is not really causing inequality in gender. We need to look at it from a broader perspective as well. We need to look at it from a socio-economical and cultural aspect as well. And it's necessary to have proper infrastructure, which brings us back to the access. Obviously, we need to have access to the internet before we can even start having the conversation. But it needs to be affordable. We need to have affordability taken into account. And we need to go beyond all of that and look at development issues from a broader perspective. We need to look at what happens after people get online, after women and girls get online. And that brings me to the meaningful access that we mentioned earlier already. What do you do once you get online? How do you use the internet? How does it make your life better? How does it put some humanity in the center of that technology? Crucial in this effort is also the role of role models. And we've seen some amazing examples yesterday, thanks to the Equals in Tech Awards. Internet Society has also ran a campaign on Shine the Light to actually shine some light on those amazing projects that all of these amazing young girls and women are doing around the world. And this is bringing some inspiration to other women to probably step up and do the same. We actually need to make sure that we build that community of success stories and make sure that we attract more women in that. And Internet Society, I'm very proud to say, has actually a special interest group on women that was created and launched last month. So I encourage all of you to join and be part of those discussions. But talking of role models, I just wanted to highlight one. We have an IGF ambassador here this week. Her name is Josephine Melissa. She's actually working with Tuna Panda in Nairobi. She's working in Kibera, in one of the bigger slums. And she told me her story on what they do at Tuna Panda. And after bringing connectivity to the slums and actually providing some opportunities and capacity building for women to start their businesses and to grow their businesses, they also realized that there's need to expand it beyond just capacity building on how to use the internet, but also, as was mentioned earlier, is to look at financial opportunities. Where do you get the finances to then actually expand your businesses? So how do you fully take advantage of that access that you now have? And how can you continue to build on that? The last point I wanted to make is that we have to continue the fight, because the gender equality starts from a very young age. And if I may, I want to share a very short personal story. I have a young boy. He's turning 6 in January. And he came back home. My husband is amazingly supportive. At home, we talk about gender equality. Girls and boys are the same. We really make a big deal out of that at home. One day he comes home and his favorite color is red. And he starts drawing and he pick a color and he's like, Mom, I don't like this one. And I look at the color and it's pink. And he says, that's a girl's color. I don't want this. And I looked at him and he said, well, it's a color like any other. And I said, it's actually your favorite color mixed with some white. And he looked at me puzzled and he's like, oh, so it's my favorite color mixed with something else. I can live with that. And so he continued drawing. And so it dawned on me that we have to actually fight the pink. We have to fight from a very young age. We have to fight the fact that pink is just for girls, that technology is just for men, and that access needs to be given to a certain part of the population. And that opportunity actually should not be pink. It should be red and white. And we should actually make sure that all of us have the same access to the opportunity that the internet is providing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, for reminding us again. Yeah. about the need to actually go much deeper when we talk about gender and internet governance, right? To the roots of patriarchy, to the roots of sort of gender roles, etc. We actually decided that we would do this whole session in a way where we could get audience participation at different points of time. So now I would like to invite 2 or 3 questions from the floor directed at any of our speakers, or comments or thoughts. And if you could also introduce yourself.
Sí, muchas gracias. En primer lugar, quisiera dar las gracias a las panelistas. Es un honor realmente participar en una sesión principal sobre género. Yo trabajo en la embajada, en la misión permanente de Cuba en Ginebra, aunque ahora atiendo los temas de la Unión Internacional de Telecomunicaciones. Estuve 15 años trabajando en los temas de los derechos de la mujer. Fui la negociadora de Cuba para crear la entidad de género ONU Mujeres. Es un honor para mí haber sido la representante que negoció la creación de ONU Mujeres cuando estuve de misión en Nueva York, en la misión de Cuba en Nueva York. Mi pregunta está dirigida a las 3 panelistas, pero particularmente a la señora Bogdan, en cuanto a qué pudiera hacer la conferencia de plenipotenciarios próximo año, en octubre, en Dubái. Sabemos que es una conferencia importante de la Unión, donde se toman decisiones para los próximos 4 años. ¿Cuál es su visión? Sabemos que, bueno, la Unión Internacional de Telecomunicaciones ha avanzado mucho en el tema de la política de género, pero ¿cuál es su opinión? ¿Qué debemos hacer los Estados miembros en esa conferencia de plenipotenciarios en Dubái en octubre del próximo año? Muchas gracias.
Would you like to answer that? Or if there are a couple more questions, we can just take all of them together and then get the panelists to answer. I see another hand up.
Okay. So I would like to live in a world where genders are accepted. But I think that we are not the same. Not only women's being from rural community or being disabled or being refugee. We are not all the same heterosexual. And being LGBT and being an LBT, it's really make a big difference in the possibility to access. Because the legislation, the digitization of people's bodies tell the difference and impose a difference that means not accessing. So I think we need to really talk about those data, the data in the body of the people and how they're embedded. Because if I'm from the global south and India is doing a lot of this, and we hear and read a lot about the challenge trans person are surviving, are fighting, because I need to be part of benefit. But once that I'm there, visualized, I'm at the mercy of a legislation, a social stigma. And also I would like that we don't think technology is not neutral. Technology, the technology we are using comes from a specific place of power, which is white as myself, but it's male, and it's capitalist, and it's for profit. And I think that we need to challenge many things. And it's not only about because the pink, it's embedded in a very specific way of thinking. And I think it's important that we understand that it's not just a generic 50% of the world that is not connected. It's a specific. And what are we doing with our privilege?
If there are no more questions, may I ask the panelists to respond to oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you to Internet Society for the support it's given to women as a member of ISOC. It's important to organizations take action to issues on gender and women and invite them to collaborate and work together with a new special interest group, the Women's and Internet Society. this space finally seek to collaborate and empower women. Thank you.
Great. May we now ask the three panelists to respond? Yeah. Okay, if you can make it really brief, because we were going to just do 3 questions and then move on. We don't want to open it up too much at this point. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, but really short. Yeah.
Perdón, no había entendido que podía hablar ahora. Alejandra Ramuspe, del Gobierno de Uruguay. Una pregunta para Joyce, sobre todo. Las fronteras para la brecha de género no están solo en la tecnología, sino que vienen de otras áreas de la política. En Uruguay hay un serio problema para que las mujeres estudien ciencias, carreras de ciencias o de tecnología. Quería preguntar si hay algunos ejemplos en el mundo donde esta brecha de acceso a la educación tecnológica haya sido exitoso, digamos. Si se conoce.
Thank you, and we'll now hear from the panelists. So would anybody like to start? Go ahead, Doreen. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a quick comment on the last question from Uruguay. There are a number of examples where we have seen a major shift, even in specific university programs, where they've been able to go from sort of 10, 20% women in STEM to now graduating classes of over 50%. Harvey Mudd is one good example in the United States. If I could touch quickly on the question from my friend from Cuba. Next year, the ITU will hold their Plenipotentiary Conference. This is the main governing body of the International Telecommunications Union, where the elected management team is elected, the governing council is elected, but it's also the place where the strategic plan and the 4-year work program is adopted by the member states. We have a resolution, which is Resolution 70, that is linked to our work in gender, and in that resolution we recognize Girls in ICT Day, the 4th Thursday of the 4th month. And we also recognize a number of other gender-related activities that we carry out primarily in our development sector. So it's likely that we would be updating that to reflect some of the decisions that took place at the World Telecommunications Development Conference. But I would also like to mention that it's an opportunity for member states. The process is member state driven. So for member states that are committed and care about this issue, they should be making concrete proposals on this issue to the Plenipotentiary Conference. We on the Secretariat side will encourage member states to bring gender-balanced delegates. We actually track the number of women participants. We started to track the number of times women actually take the microphone at our meetings. We would also encourage member states to nominate women as chairs of committees, of working groups, of drafting groups, because it's very important to get more women involved in the discussions and the negotiation process that takes place within the International Telecommunications Union. And finally, I also wanted to mention we're running an open consultation right now on the digital gender gap for one of our council working groups. So I would invite all of you to contribute to that process. It's an open process. The deadline, I believe, closes on the 3rd of January. Thank you.
Chennai, would you like to say something?
Thanks, Bishaka. I want to respond specifically to the questions around what our privilege means. Sorry. I wanted to respond specifically to the question around privilege and technology, as well as the divide to access and technology. I think for me personally, what's always missing from these conversations is that the context that people exist in determines what the effect of technology will have. So even if you provide me with technology, but if I come from a family that insists that technology is the devil, it's going to be pointless. And I think for me personally, recognizing my privilege as a young woman who's grown up in a family that's allowed for me to be educated, it has always been my role to always go back and try to understand the experiences of the other young women, and how then do we make sure that what is their desire when it comes to accessing technology, what is it that they want to achieve. the research that we've been doing at looking at youth and internet use has actually highlighted that the biggest misconception of young people always being on social media is that they're wasting time. But what we found in one of the entrepreneurial communities in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Nigeria is that they're actually using these platforms to sell their goods. They're actually using these platforms to push their businesses, or they're hustling for one thing or another. So I think when it comes to the position of privilege and technology, it's really about backing down from our own understanding of what it means for people to have access, from our own understanding of what is meaningful access. And so that also responds to the question around the divide to access of technology and the policies, that there needs to be a focus beyond simply providing technology, but actually breaking down some of the cultural norms that make it impossible for people to be able to access technology. Because I think there's a disregard from policymakers to probably not want to engage in the other core issues that make it impossible for young women or women in the rural areas to actually make use of the internet. So for example, in one of our case studies that we did, we found that women in rural areas were most likely not to be online most of the time because there was the fear of gender-based violence. And this is not gender-based violence online, this is gender-based violence offline. So for the sake of peace, you don't go online. But then the question becomes, are tech policy initiatives working together with women's units or gender rights ministries? So that's my contribution.
And Joyce, we're running out of time, so if I can just ask you to be very brief.
Yeah. Will do. Thank you. Just a couple of comments. Coming back to Uruguay specifically, as we see, there's quite a few interesting initiatives that we see that are handled through community efforts. There's Coding Sisters, which is an initiative that happened in Turkey. We've seen that through our chapter-thon, which was an amazing initiative where coding was done for children, young girls. We have Girls in ICT, which is obviously another initiative that many of us are aware of. We had the first women IGF in Sri Lanka this year through the Internet Society chapter as well. Those are initiatives that actually make a difference in the national perception. Now, having said that, what we also see is, thinking of the SDGs, is that we looked at SDG 5, but also SDG 4, as we think that education is also very much linked. We had a discussion with a number of ministries around education and ICT, and what we see is that I'll push it back to Uruguay because it's one of the good examples here. Is that in some countries we start seeing now national initiatives to bring ICT and education, and those initiatives like Plan Ceibal, for example, in Uruguay, and there's others, actually provide also access to ICT to young women at an early age. And actually we see that that makes a difference. I don't have exact numbers here, but we see that it makes a difference in the choice of education. It is actually improving the access to young girls and actually encouraging them to keep an open mind on where they want to go in the future, and actually addressing ICT issues and participating in the discussions around IG issues. And so I think there's some very successful initiatives already, and I think we need to continue to push them and show the success stories to the other countries so that we can continue to implement that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, Chennai, Doreen, and Joyce, and we will now give them a round of applause and move on to the next. I think in the interests of time, after the next segment, we won't immediately take questions. We'll do 2 segments together and then take questions, because we want to make sure our speakers can have the time to say what they want. And we would request all speakers to limit their intervention to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, so can we have Amos Tor for the next segment? We'll combine the 2 segments so that we limit time for movement. Veronica Berger, Titi, and Maria. Desiree will dial in, right? Yeah, she's online. Okay, we will move on to her. So thank you to our panelists who just move on and limit your interventions to 3 minutes. So we're going to look at frameworks of engaging with gender and internet policy, looking at women's human rights, intersectionality, and also gender-based violence. Then we will look at innovation and emerging technologies with regards to gender inclusion. Okay, so I'll start with Veronica. Please introduce yourself when you give your intervention. Why is it important to build internet governance on international human rights? You've done a lot of work on human rights and women's rights. Why is it important to build that on internet governance, human rights standards? And how can you also give us, examples of how the UN human rights mechanisms have addressed women's rights, gender equality, and the internet issues?
Yes, thank you very much, Emilar. My name is Veronica. I work with the UN Human Rights Office, where I head the Women's Human Rights and Gender section. And I'm really, really honored to be able to be part of this discussion today. So from the perspective of the UN Human Rights Office, I wanted to make just a few points to answer your question. The first point, which has already been made, is that the online space is not a free right space. The human rights that are applicable offline are also applicable online. And this has been acknowledged by the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. And it means that the human rights framework and the work of the human rights mechanisms must be seen as a helpful source of guidance to states and private companies to ensure that ICTs support human rights, including gender equality. The second point is that, as human rights mechanisms have pointed out, those suffering from marginalization and exclusion offline also tend to suffer from the same online. And the use of ICTs has become critical for the realization of a number of human rights. We've heard, of course, about the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of assembly, but also the right to education, the right to health, and the right to have access to economic opportunities, and many others, as we've heard in the examples before. And so the obligation of states to promote access from ICTs can be derived from those rights. And while states may not have the capacity to immediately provide universal access to ICTs, the human rights framework places an obligation on states to address the gender digital divide, because the gender digital divide entrenches, perpetuates, and aggravates discrimination against women and girls. So it is a human rights concern that must be addressed. The third point that I wanted to make is that the guidance provided by human rights mechanisms to combat discrimination and violence offline is an extremely useful tool to address discrimination and violence online, as the root causes tend to be the same, as we heard before. And so the obstacles to women's access and use of ICTs or public participation in the digital space are the same often than the obstacles to women's participation in public space offline. It can be lack of adequate financial resources, it can be limitations on freedom of movement, it can be harmful gender stereotypes, as we've heard before. And these differences exist not by chance, but because there is gender-based discrimination that states have an obligation to address. And the fourth point that I wanted to make, just to conclude my opening remarks, is that we can apply the lessons that we've learned through years of struggle to promote gender equality and women's rights offline to efforts to promote gender equality online. And there are many lessons that we could discuss, but I just wanted to mention a few overarching lessons. The first is that without targeted measures to address discrimination, exclusion and privilege tend to perpetuate themselves. Yet, there isn't enough attention to gender equality in intergovernment policies or enough attention to ICTs in gender equality policies. The second lesson, which is also linked to the first, is that many women, as we've heard before, suffer from intersecting forms of discrimination that result in two specific obstacles and needs that must be deliberately addressed in these policies. And the third is that efforts to promote gender equality online must look at women as subjects of rights and not as objects of protection, because the protection narrative can be quite dangerous and in fact result into keeping women off the online space. Just in terms of the work of the human rights mechanisms, we can elaborate on that before, but a number of them have provided recommendations. I think we have in the room a member of the CEDAW committee, so she can also elaborate on that. But even in the Universal Periodic Review, in the second cycle, there have been over 140 recommendations on human rights online. Now, the work of the human rights mechanisms, with the exception of those looking at specifically at gender equality and women's rights and some others, has not necessarily been informed by gender considerations. And so there is certainly a need for a closer partnership between the IGF constituencies and the human rights mechanisms so that they can strengthen their guidance in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to the inputs from the member that you mentioned just now. And I want to move on to Amos Tor. Yes. In your experience, has the IGF successfully addressed issues of intersectionality in the policy discussions, and not just this IGF, or all the other IGFs? If you have been part of that, or if you've seen the outcomes from the IGFs, if they've been successful, and just introduce yourself as well, please.
Thank you. I work with David Kaye, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. So in some ways, my remarks kind of build upon what he actually talked about just an hour ago. And in order to kind of address your question, I think, there is a lot of discussion about intersectionality and about the issues that intersect. But the danger also is on the flip side of that these discussions can take place in silos. And so I just want to flag maybe 6 general intersections. I know I have only, now I only have 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But I think it's important to flesh out the intersections between sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's really the first kind of broad intersection, right? That isn't necessarily always reflected in our conversations both at IGF and beyond. And queer online populations, include cis women and trans men and women that may also identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so on and so forth, of various sexualities. And in a way it's heartening to know that it's already recognized at an intergovernmental level through the establishment in 2016 of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Independent Expert Mandate. The question, I think, for us is then what kind of trend lines and what kind of concerns arise at this intersection. And so those are my other 5 intersections. And the second one really is the intersection of sexual orientation, gender identity, and the exercise of economic, social, and cultural rights, right? Which we don't necessarily really see getting kind of a lot of discussion in the civil and political rights space and in the digital rights space. We did a kind of an analysis of the communications that was put out by the Special Rapporteur's mandate to governments, and we saw that the communications coming over the transom in relation to LGBTI activists and defenders many of the human rights defenders in this space were not just working on sexual identity issues narrowly conceived, but many of them also work in areas of reproductive health, on HIV, access to healthcare of sex workers, artistic expression, and so on and so forth. And so we see certainly a very close intersection there. Thirdly, we see an intersection between offline and online violence against people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, right? And one of the communications that we reflects this very clearly. It was about queer activists who had participated in a diversity parade in September 2012 in Curitiba in Brazil. And their participation led to a series of escalating online attacks, culminating in fake Facebook profiles being set up in their name and comments that were not from them, but the perpetrators kind of masquerading as them and sending death threats and racist and homophobic comments to their friends and family. So you can see kind of the very clear crossover between online and offline violence. And this brings me to the fourth intersection between state obligations and social norms, right? We not only see restrictions from states on these groups, but we also see that there's a vacuum in terms of state protection of human rights. We see that states go silent when queer communities report abuse and violence, and particularly in the form of inadequate and insensitive investigatory measures that are undertaken after reports of violence. And we also see that the legislative and policy frameworks that restrict LGBT spaces also contribute or facilitate discrimination and hatred, because they don't just suppress LGBTI speech, they suppress public discourse about LGBTI communities. And so kind of the fifth and sixth intersections I'll take together as I'm running out of time is the intersection between public space and private norms. And so many of the issues that are discussed at IGF, like terms of service enforcement, transparency on platforms, as David was talking about earlier, most particularly affect people who are working at this intersection. And the last intersection is really that we need to methodologically think not just about law and policy discussions, but we need to introduce kind of social science and behavioral science approaches that can ground some of the policy assumptions we are making. And I want to kind of just do a shout out to Research ICT Africa and Chennai, because they do really important work about some of like the policy about some of the fact-based drivers of like the gaps that we are seeing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful input into the conversation. We'll move on to Patricia from the floor, or yes, she can invite her to come to. Is Patricia from the CID? Yes. Are you ready now, or you can speak from there? And what I would like you to address is online gender-based violence. How has this space, this IGF space, has it been a key space to drive this conversation on online gender-based violence? And what has surfaced in the discussions?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can answer that, because from the perspective of the committee, so I'm a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and we deal with 24 countries per year. We receive reports from state parties, and we receive shadow reports from NGOs, and most generally the information, the most important information we get on these aspects come from the NGO side. We have been trying to address gender-based violence online in a number of our general recommendations, and maybe surprisingly for some of you it will come that the longest text is not in the general recommendation 35 on gender-based violence, but on a different general recommendation, a new one, number 36, on women and girls' access to education. And there we have a whole a series of paragraphs on cyberbullying, for instance, and the responsibility of states to prevent these phenomena. So I think that's what I wanted to bring. We also have addressed those issues in other recommendations, such as the one on access to justice, and showing, wait, I'll try and find the, we've been dealing with the obstacles faced in the collection of evidence relating to emerging violations of women's rights occurring online and through the use of ICT and new social media. So we're really trying in our guidance to state parties to address these forms of violence in addition to the more, well, to the offline, very numerous forms that we deal with at every dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope you'll stay and answer any questions if we have from the floor. Now we move on to the innovation and new and emerging technologies, where we have Titi and Maria Paz and Desiree who will dial in. So we'll start with Maria, move to Titi, and then Desiree as the last speaker. And what I want to find out, Maria, is what new challenges do emerging and data-driven technologies present for women's rights and gender equality in the new age, in the digital age?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. The first most important challenge that the new technology and in particular the data-driven technologies confront in relationship to gender consideration is precisely the idea of make a real subject. Women's make the real subject of this technology and not the object, as we have heard before, also from Veronica, when it comes to rights. And what I mean by this is like to really plug into the technology, into the design, into the values that we insert in the technology, a truly feminist approach by design. But this consideration starts from the point to acknowledge that the technology is not neutral, something that sometimes it's formally recognized today by many, but hardly recognized in a more concrete and practical way, looking into procedures and approaches to build technology that really take into consideration the fact that we are very diverse in general, but in particular, gender make us different in the way in which we express our needs, our sensitive, and a lot of many different kind of things that are not considered today when we feed technology with the traditional considerations that have been traditionally dominated by a more male approach. And this is very particularly important for the fact of that we are currently relying more and more on algorithmic decision making without being sure in how this algorithm technology is fed. So as someone else pointed out before, we need to first have more transparency to understand which criteria are feeding this algorithmic technology. Then we know that probably are part of the dominant view of the world, which I say it's dominantly male. But as someone else also mentioned before, to know what we are missing, the first thing is that we need to data about what is there. So another thing that I want to point it out also is to come back to the point that Valentina made before, that when we are talking about gender and when we are talking about women, we are not talking about an homogenic category. We are talking about a bunch of different realities. They are women in the rural context, they are indigenous women, they are women with non-conforming sexuality, as Amos pointed out. So again, when we construct the technologies, we need to acknowledge that diversity, and we need to acknowledge that that diversity requires a process in which this technology not only it's fed for one time, but how it can evolve with a more comprehensive approach of how all these different realities evolve over the time, and provide mechanisms to make the corrections in the system to have this into consideration. The last point that I want to make is that usually when it comes to women and the use of technology and the data-driven technology, we focus too much on the part of how to address the online violence that in general women confront. And I think that we still need to focus a lot on that because it's something that we haven't fixed. But at the same time, I think that many women are just tired to just focus in the resistance, and they want to also have like a more positive approach in the sense to have more opportunities to build their own empowerment through the access, the real access that someone was talking before, not just the connection, but the ability to be the subject of the creation of the content that they need to see available for them. And in that sense, I invite you to review a report that my organization, Derechos Digitales, did with mapping out a lot of initiatives in Latin America. The name is Latin America in a Glimpse. You can find there a lot of these approaches that acknowledge the diversity of women and how they are trying to build a space and connect to technology to be a real subject and have this more positive approach to fulfill their needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Desiree. Is she online? Okay, let's move to Titi. Titi, you are the head of policy and government relations for Google in Africa. And what are the inclusive models that private sector or your company can develop and support on the area of innovation and empowerment when we're talking about women?
Okay, thanks, Amila. Good evening, everyone, again. Brief introduction, Titi Akisami. For me, it's super exciting. One of the few times I've been in this room, it's been over 15 years now that I've been coming into the room. And it's super exciting to actually have a main session on gender. I don't know how many people who are sitting in the room recall the WSIS Youth Caucus and making a case, I see you, for the inclusion of gender issues, youth issues, and to get to the point where we are at sincerely is amazing. And I'm super humbled to still be a part of the process and to be able to have this conversation with you today. I will try not to be too controversial because I know there will be people who have particular questions based on the hat that I have, but I'd like to be able to start with this. We don't have any new challenges. We have amplified challenges. And I'm very specific to say that because when you indicate you have new challenges, it more or less begins to distract from the fact that we've been faced with so much that has not been addressed, but we've been given a platform that has made it exponentially more painful to be a woman. Pause. So, the strategies that we have previously adopted around building capacity, increasing knowledge, mechanisms and paths for redress, these need to be adapted to address the violations of the rights that we see. I think we have a lot of experts sitting in the room. I'll do my best not to repeat anything anyone else has said. So the question is, how do we ensure that the strategies are being early enough integrated into what is being innovated or built in such a way that we are not trying to redress them, but we're actually making sure they don't even arise at all? And for me, I think that is where the crucial thing is. How do we adopt, how do we ensure that these new technologies actually enhance our rights and not degrade them further? And this is not to say that it's not happening or that it does not create potentially new variations of the same problems. And I'll give a couple of examples. Have we always had body shaming? Yes. Is this exponentially more painful when it's shared on any of the platforms without mentioning any? Definitely. So one of the things that we see, and I say we now, wearing completely the hat of Google, that we see to address this is, I believe, was inferred by the last speaker, is STEAM. I didn't say STEM, and I think people love acronyms in this environment. So STEAM, how many people have heard of STEAM? Please, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. STEAM, it means bringing, it's no longer STEM education, it's science, technology, education, but you include arts, which brings in the social norms, the social sciences, the creativity, and adds it on one level. Second level is this, sincerely, we cannot speak about it too much. ICT, Girls in ICT Day is great, but one of the things that we have found, and as a, I can still claim it, right? Young, black, African woman sitting on this table, the young part I'm not quite sure about some of these days, as one who is able to identify all those nomenclatures, one thing I find is when I search for things that are African or black in nature, the feedback I get does not reflect my reality. It's the same with the women. And sincerely, I'm done with blaming the folks who design it. Where we have found, as Google, that you can best address this particular challenge is ensuring that we are actually able to design ourselves for us and for others. That, for me, is the biggest way we can create change. We can create change by addressing the policy concerns, by being very specific in terms of the kinds of interventions we put in place. But if you want to really be a part of the process that creates that lasting change, that addresses new technologies, that looks to the conversations around artificial intelligence, etc., is we borrow some of what the GDPR has done, which means we think about the future, which means we need to be able to educate and include in the education that we give young girls, irrespective of their present realities, the ability to connect with and be a part of the creation process that is new technologies. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Titi. 15 years ago, some companies were not yet even born, that will not mention by names. Can we have Desiree? Is she online now? Okay. Please.
Hi, Emilia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I will start with agreeing with what Titi has said, if you can hear me well, in terms of how to address some of these challenges that we are facing. And specifically, I will be saying a few words about the data-driven technologies and like algorithmic decision-making, smart house, smart cities, digital identity cards, and what kind of hard problems and challenges do they pose for gender equality in the digital age. And again, I have to agree with Titi. This is not a new problem, but amplified in many, many ways. So maybe I'll just start with giving you a few examples and then perhaps closing with a few recommendations of what could be done. First example would have to do with a gender, technology gender biased design, I think that has been mentioned by many others, and then go into the gender decision making by humans and then artificial intelligence and the algorithmic decision making, which is now very, very critical and most important to be addressed as an issue. Maybe a first example would be that in January this year, I went and visited the Internet of Women Things house in Turin in Italy. And this house has been designed to take into requirements from women. And the idea behind it is very simple. It is that many of our technological devices today and good gadgets that we may also buy, including Internet of Things gadgets, may actually be designed by a man for men. And rather than for things that benefit life or are addressing needs of other groups. But that's something that we're familiar with. Something that is maybe more surprising is how the new report that has found that GitHub, and I think most of you know this is a big, huge repository of open source software, that the coding changes that have been submitted and suggested by women actually had a higher approval. But then, and higher approval than those suggested changes submitted by men. But that actually worked only if the gender was unidentifiable. So that was a big, I think, a letdown. But thirdly, I think this harder problem is the problem that we do not have any policies in place for at the moment. And this is the problem of the opaque algorithms, the machine learning, the algorithmic decision making, and that will certainly is affecting gender equality. So what I think we need is a call, and we need to work all together on a neutral, non-biased and transparent algorithms, because we know how they're going to affect our lives in multiple times on all levels. And maybe to give some crude examples, we know there is a research of women who have been of women and men, rather teenagers in California, and 70% of them who have been surveyed, and they do not want to say what gender they are. So they decided to keep that private. And that's just some kind of a little notion of how these big databases of data will be filled with preferences and their accuracies. And there is no way of checking the facts. And I would have to describe that issue as a bias issue. And it's not just the impartial assessment of facts that we miss, it's also legally judgment based on preconceived judges, or preconceived notions and prejudice. So in closing, you can imagine big systems and far-fetched future where you can have a machine learning wanting to use the database of last elections for the last 50 years, and may want to prefer that only men over 50 years get elected, and so on. So the consequences of algorithm decision making are huge, and I would say there are a lot of bright and smart people in the room, and that we all need to work together to engage in this multi-stakeholder process in a multidisciplinary way, to have policies in place that will address those biases, which are really hard problems to tackle. I'm sure I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to make sure that different topics get treated in this fashion, not only by a single stakeholder or only by men in their 20s or 60s or whatever the bias might be on that day. We need those processes for computerized processes as well in real life, as the UN declaration rules that refer to individual rights. We have to have those rights for algorithmic decision making as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desiree, for your important inputs. We are getting messages that there is an APC party. We need to hurry up. But there were key points in this panel, one of them being that women are not a homogeneous group, and we need targeted measures to address discrimination. We cannot provide solutions for the problems that we do not know, and these are not new problems. We need a feminist approach by design and translate some of the lessons that we learn offline to our online campaigns and initiatives. We will open the floor for questions. Be brief in your interventions so that we can quickly.
How can I? Yes, thank you. I would like to ask the panelists a question that I have heard a lot during the event, but not with this approach. And I believe it's apply well here because will give us some perspective. There are many challenges with regard to gender equality on the internet, which includes sexism, hate speech, revenge porn, difficulty assessing socially and economically, etc. And during the event, I realized the existence of many projects and programs to overcome this inequality in various parts of the world. Taking into consideration these projects and the issues raised here, how do you think that gender situation will be on the internet in the next 10 years?
Thank you. We'll get another question. I think it was from here, yes.
My name is Nandini. I'm from an organization called IT for Change in India. And my question is related to the overall subject of the panel, which was about framing a women's rights approach to internet public policy issues. So the question is addressed to all the panelists. So one thing is, when we are talking about framing an indivisible and integrated kind of approach to women's rights and bringing it into internet public policy issues, how do we deal with the fact that there is no one forum where internet-related public policy is discussed today? There are like trade and IP debates. There are many other forums. What should be the strategies we adopt when we push for this agenda amidst these fragmented forums? And the second part of the question is that increasingly our language, the language we use as women's rights advocates of rights and empowerment, we see that is being increasingly co-opted. Just a week ago at WTO, we all know there was this proposal to issue a joint declaration on trade and women's economic empowerment, and then women's organizations from the global south, they wrote an open letter about this kind of pink washing. So in this kind of situation, when we are not sure, like when everyone's speaking the same language but meaning very different things, what are the strategies we should adopt and how do we move forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? And I just want to remind you to be brief, because our translators, interpreters need to leave in the next few minutes. So if we can just be brief in our interventions. Panelists, any responses to the questions? The first one was on gender in the next 10 years. How do you see the conversations evolving? And the other questions.
Okay. I wish I could have the ability to tell the answer to that question. Of sure, all those projects that you have the opportunity of seeing during these days are very valuable, and I think we should all collectively be very proud of ourselves of being working in relevant initiative, not only for us, but for many women that are not able to be here today. Those are the most important, because in some way, the ones that we are on the front, we have the privilege to have more tools and forum where to speak, and are those that are back home that have to deal day by day with the consequences of the decision making at policy level. I think those are very relevant, but also I think that we will be effective in change the game in the next 10 years if we are able to make this kind of project initiatives and the thinking behind of them part of the mainstream also. Because many times we have seen that there are a lot of congratulation about setting a price and give like some money for initiatives, but we think that it's very valuable, but not enough, because that it's only like putting in a silo the issue of gender inclusion, and what we need is to put it also in the mainstream. That we need that the big companies, the ones that have like the big number of users around the world, engage also these principles. I think if we are able to make this hack in the next 10 years, probably this will be like a very different conversation. I have a big hope that that can happen, but I think that that's not possible if we don't have like a multi-stakeholder approach. We need the support of the technicals, especially, and the willingness of the private sector, and the support of the government, recognizing that this is just an evolution of the recognition of the human rights in the traditional physical space, but now in the digital space.
Thank you, Maria. I'll suggest that we have the next panel and some of the questions maybe Bishaka that the floor have asked can be moved to that session if possible, so that we can have some time for the last session. Thank you so much to the panelists. Yes, thank you.
Can we give them? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we are moving to the last segment, and can we invite our speakers for that segment to come up on stage? So I would ask Tara, Chat, Lise, Avri, and Lizette to come up on stage. And Lise, you need to leave, so you will be. Okay, we move to the final segment of the session on gender and the future of the internet, which is a really critical segment looking at gender and internet governance. And we have 4 speakers. I would like to actually start with Lise Fuhr, who's the director of the European Telecommunications Network Operators Association. Thank you, Lise. I know you have to leave in 10 minutes to catch your flight, but thank you for being with us. Yeah. And the question actually that I wanted to ask everybody on the panel, excuse me, is to really think about gender and internet governance from your context as well as in the context of the IGF. To what extent are gender issues being discussed and addressed here? What is still left? And does gender influence the framing and prioritization of other internet governance topics, or does it sit in a silo by itself?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for actually initiating this discussion. I come from the Nordic countries. I come from Denmark, where gender is supposed to be very equal, and it's not. So I think it's a very, very important discussion still. Regarding governance and why is this important? Well, the obvious answer is actually we need diversity in everything. So if you look at governance, we would like to have the same amount of women there as there are in the world. And if we look at some of the numbers, I don't see that this is mirrored. We actually have some numbers saying that women are 50% less likely to use the internet than men. This is from the World Wide Web Foundation. If we look at Europe as a region, which is also supposed to be very much in front on gender equality, and we have a 7 million ICT industry, and we only have 30% of women there, I think we lose out of a lot of good women and good qualities if we don't include women. But if I look at Europe or Brussels, we see some signs of things are getting better. I myself is heading a leading trade association, ETNO, which represent the biggest telcos in Europe. We actually have 3 out of 5 leading trade associations are led by women. This is a movement that has been going on the last 3 years. So we actually have Afke Schatz, who's heading GSMA in Brussels. We have Cecilia Bonifet-Dahl, who's heading Digital Europe, and I'm heading ETNO. So I actually think we see some movement. And if I go to the Commission, our new commissioner, Commissioner Gabriel. Of course, she's a woman too. And so we see some good movements in Brussels. And I think this is important for all internet governance and governance in general, because we need some role models here. And the two leading rapporteurs on a big telco regulation, the code in Brussels, are also women. That's Pilar del Castillo and Mia Petra Kumpula-Natri. And I think these are important for all the young women. When I talk to a lot of young women, they need role models. And I think if we can lead by example and really show that you can, if you try and if you want, I think we can get more to get out there. And of course, we need all the help from the politicians in actually creating the rules and the awareness that's needed. So I'm not saying it's just a walk in the park just because you have role models, but I think that's a good start.
Thank you so much, Lise. And our next speaker is Avri Doria, who's part of the IRTF Human Rights Protocol Consideration Research Group. Avri is also a veteran at Internet governance, having been there right from the early days of the IGF, and actually has played a significant role in putting gender on the agenda. So, Avri, I'd like you to talk about, if you could give us very quickly a sort of your sense of what has shifted and what's still left to be done.
Okay, thank you. Avri Doria speaking. And first, from the first panel, I feel like I must apologize for having worn a pink shirt. I didn't do it on purpose. It just happened to be the shirt that was next in line. But anyway, so I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about the first time that within the IETF, actually when I was in the IETF NOMCOM, and I was chair of the NOMCOM, and one of the things that was whispered to me by many people is, you gotta make sure you get at least one woman on the leadership panel. We don't have any, we need one. And indeed, we were able to, but it was difficult and it almost took trickery to pull it off. Now, the IRTF, the Internet Research Task Force, is led by a woman. The IETF is chaired by a woman. So in that, there are many of the area directors that are women. There are many working group chairs. So within the engineering part of governance, standards making, whatever term you want to use, there has been an incredible difference. When I first got involved in that world, the only area that women could leave was a group called the users group. And that's, you know, sort of like staying home. So that is huge. Now, in terms of the IGF, you know, we have a woman leading here. The working group on internet governance was well balanced, and you know, I think the women within that group basically were able to get a lot done, not by force of their arguments so much as they did the work. They wrote the first drafts and such. So I think there's a difference here too, that now the multi-stakeholder advisory group, which I'm on for one more day, is well balanced. It has women in its leadership. It has women being active and such. So I think within the IGF, certainly we've seen a change. But there is an immense amount more to be done, because these are very rarefied areas. The second you step out of them, the second you step into an engineering environment or into a policy environment that isn't one of these places where we're trying very hard, you find that it falls away, and that the world is still somewhat similar to the world of 2000 and perhaps before. But there are good things that are happening, and within our little piece of it, I think that things have improved much, so there is reason for a bit of cheer, if not complete optimism and belief that the world has changed, because we know that the engineering world is still largely male-dominated, and all the statistics do hold.
Thank you very much, Avri. Our next speaker, I am going to ask Chat Garcia Ramilo, who's the Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications, which we know as APC, to talk about what you think still needs to be done if we want to really take the gender and internet governance agenda to the next level.
I think number one is to do more of what we've been doing. If I look back at the past, like even in the World Summit of Information Society, which Titi alluded to, you know, we had to fight to get a paragraph on gender. And it was a big fight, but then, you know, it really built up to where we are now. There are strategies that we've used, I think, that have been very useful. So for example, the gender report cards. APC started, you know, experimenting on a gender report card, which has been used in other fields before, right? In 2011. I was just looking at the gender report card for 2016, and there's still a difference, you know, there's still a gap there. And I think what might be useful is to look at 2011 to now, no? We have 7 years, and see what kinds of movements there have been, so that we have some evidence. Because if I just share with you what was in 2017, is that 37% of the panelists were women, which means, you know, it's still quite a difference there. And moderator, etc. I won't go into the numbers, but because you can look at it. But I do think that we can look at that and see where it's shifted, but over time. There's also in the gender report card, not only participation, not only who are on the panels, but also what's being said, what kinds of issues. And I think there the numbers are less, which means then that, you know, the issues around gender are still very significantly less than there are, or focus on gender, or focus on women's rights, for example, are still not as mainstreamed, although there's been an improvement in the past few years. For example, I'm very active in the Asia Pacific Regional IGF, and we also adopted the gender report cards. And in fact, when there is reporting, I think you do build consciousness. So the data now is that there's 49%, 50% women. And I think maybe the last bit that I wanted to add is, one thing that's very important is to bring women here. To bring women in national IGFs, to bring women in regional IGFs. And that has to be very intentional. So for example, for the Asia Pacific Regional IGF, there was the fellowships, the policy of the fellowship program was bringing 50% women. And I think that's important. It's small, but it's important. And I do think strategies that bring women's voices is very important in terms of just bringing more diversity also in the discussion, and also looking at the issues that women bring in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Chat. Next speaker is Lisette Perez, who's an official of the Directorate of International Relations and Foreign Trade of the Ministry of Communications of Cuba. Lisette, if you could talk a little about some of the efforts that have been made in Cuba to deal with the issue of sort of gender policy, internet, etc.
Muchas gracias. Primero que todo, agradezco la invitación a participar en esta sesión y aprovecho la ocasión para resaltar la importancia que tiene abordar estos temas de inclusión de género en el futuro de Internet en el marco del Foro de Gobernanza de Internet en Ginebra. En primer lugar, es importante resaltar que Cuba fue el primer país del mundo en firmar la Convención de las Naciones Unidas sobre la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación contra la mujer y el segundo del mundo en ratificarla. Y además asumió los compromisos acordados a niveles de jefes de Estado en la Cuarta Conferencia Mundial de la Mujer celebrada en Beijing en 1995, en la que se aprobó la Declaración y la Plataforma de Acción de Beijing, y participó activamente en las negociaciones y creación de la actual entidad de Naciones Unidas, ONU Mujeres. Asimismo, Cuba apoyó firmemente firmemente los acuerdos emanados de la Agenda 2030 y estamos satisfechos por el logro del ODS número 5 vinculado a la igualdad de género y el empoderamiento de las mujeres y las niñas, así como por la transversalización de la perspectiva de género en la Agenda 2030. Por tanto, la inserción de las mujeres cubanas en el proceso de desarrollo como beneficiarias y protagonistas activas se puede calificar como uno de los fenómenos sociales más exitosos ocurridos en Cuba. Basta solo mencionar que en la actualidad las mujeres representan el 48,86% en el Parlamento cubano, ubicándose en el tercer lugar a escala internacional según el informe de la Unión Interparlamentaria y las entidades de Naciones Unidas para la Igualdad de Género y el Empoderamiento de las Mujeres. En el ámbito de las telecomunicaciones, vale la pena destacar que de 22 universidades adscritas al Ministerio de Educación Superior, 10 tienen a mujeres como rectoras. En el sector educacional asociado a las carreras afines a las tecnologías de la información y la comunicación se han implementado planes educacionales que han posibilitado que 6.400 mujeres se hayan graduado en la Universidad de Ciencias Informáticas desde su creación. Lo anterior demuestra que en Cuba no existe brecha de género en el acceso a la educación tecnológica. Por lo tanto, la gobernanza de Internet entendida como un conjunto de principios, normas, reglas, procesos de tomas de decisión y actividades que implementados y aplicados de forma coordinada por gobierno, sector privado, sociedad civil y comunidad técnica definen la evolución y el uso de Internet puede jugar un importante papel para fomentar un desarrollo humano sostenible. Construir una sociedad de conocimientos inclusiva, mejorar la libre circulación, erradicar de la información y las ideas en el mundo, erradicar la publicación de contenidos que denigran a la mujer y eliminar así la brecha digital de género. En este sentido, Cuba está enfocada en garantizar los compromisos asumidos en la Cumbre Mundial sobre la Sociedad de la Información. Y sobre esto propicia la creación de un entorno habilitador sin el cual no se puede desarrollar una economía dinámica que incluya plenamente a las mujeres, así como potenciar la participación activa de las mujeres en los espacios de debate dentro de Internet. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Lisette. And our final speaker for today is Tara Dunham, who's from the Canada Global Advisory Council. And Tara, from where you sit, if you could again talk a little about, efforts that you all have made to really deal with the issue of gender and internet governance.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I'm from the Global Affairs Canada, which is our foreign service in the Government of Canada. So I'm going to bring the perspective from a policymaker within government and to answer the questions. So just a few things. I don't want, the last speaker at the end of the day, I understand everybody's ready to go. But hopefully I have a few things of interest to share with you. For those that aren't aware, the Government of Canada announced a Feminist International Agenda this year, and that has been paramount to us. As Polly must admit, thank you. I didn't do it myself, but my job is now to implement it. But what that gives us, that includes not only a feminist international assistance policy, which is the money that goes out the door. We have a women, peace and security agenda about involving women in all aspects of peace and security. And we also are taking a presidency of the G7 starting in January, and our Prime Minister announced a specific focus on gender equality and women's empowerment. So for us, that message coming from the government is not only that gender is important, but that gender remains a priority. And I think that's a message that we have to, I feel that we still have to push that message forward. As a policymaker representing government in international fora, it is a message we have to keep pushing forward. It is not addressed, and there's many things that we still need to do. What it gives me as a policymaker is that I've been very clearly articulated that we need to put gender first, and when I mean that, the government's articulated that's gender plus. So it's about inclusion and diversity of people beyond just people that identify as men as women. So that means gender plus and a human rights-based approach that is upfront in the policies and programs that we push out. And that creates an environment that we can really continue to take the steps necessary that we see to push this agenda further.
So within the work that I'm doing and my team is doing, these are some of the areas that we're working on, and I also want to share some of the challenges. So right now, after the research and engaging with various entities, we've concluded that we've moved away from focusing on addressing violent extremism and broader issues of online violence, and identified that violence against women online is a huge issue, and we need to push this in the international agenda. So we've done a lot of research this year, and we continue to engage with many around us, and so one of our challenges is continue to get the data to support that this is not just a northern issue, it is a global issue, because we've focused our year and continuing into next year is to integrate this language about violence against women online in international frameworks, and to get that acknowledged. And one of the challenges is that as a policymaker, usually what we're told by other government representatives is that is not a global issue. So I do request anyone that's able to provide data to support that, we would welcome it. The other area that we're looking at is, and it was referenced in previous panels, around where we're going from here. So there's been a lot of panels on artificial intelligence, machine learning, data, algorithms. We've also identified this as a priority for us, and that we're going to take a human rights perspective. So we're trying to answer the question, what is the role of governments in the application, rollout, development of artificial intelligence to ensure that they are human rights respecting and promoting? Governments have the obligation to protect those rights, and we need to answer the question as to what that will look like moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Yeah, I think, and before we move forward, just applause for this panel, please. Yeah. Okay, I know we already have a hand up for a question. I think the issue was we started 10 minutes late, and we are pretty much at 6 o'clock. So what I would like to suggest at this point is that we don't take any questions. The translators need to leave at 6. What, do you think we can take questions? Okay, go ahead, please, yeah.
Hi, my name is Shay, founder of Glitch UK, an organisation that trains and campaigns around online abuse. And I was also on the National Democratic Institute Gender and Women's panel yesterday. Thank you so much, Ms. Denham, for your kind of actions around what we can do, which leads me to my question. It's great that we had this, this is the first session for gender. Disappointing that it's the last session of the day, crammed when the translators have to go. How can we make sure there is more action? So we're not just a talking shop, we're not like the men. We don't just sit and talk and take photos, but it's about actions, and it's about an ongoing conversation where we're sharing best practice, we're avoiding duplication and reinventing the wheel. And then the second one is, how can we get more female engineers into the room? I definitely heard in the panel before that we need to look at STEAM, fantastic, but they are female engineers. So how can we make sure that there's affirmative action or positive discrimination to get them into the room, and making sure they are the gender plus, which I love, by the way. Props to you for gender plus. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question, the last question of the day, or the last comment of the day, if anybody from the floor would like to make one. Yes, please.
Hello, Marianne Franklin, Internet Rights and Principles Coalition. I'd just like to give the organisers and these wonderful women in the room and all the people they represent a great big thank you for getting us to the very first gender main session. And I think the last comments are all absolutely correct, but we start with one small step. So thank you very much for getting us to this point, our chair and our panelists and our contributors over the last 10 years of IGF and related forums. Thank you very much. I'm very proud to be here. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to answer that question? Yeah.
Sure, I can say a few words. So one of the things, I'm very action-oriented. I'm always trying to find solutions. And usually people come to me right off as a government rep and say, we need to legislate, we need to do... There's a lot of things we can do. So at the IGF this year, we had a session on a playbook. And the idea here, a playbook to work towards gender equity. And so what we're trying to do there is give the opportunity for people to give the ideas of what are the actions already taking place, so we can stop repeating over and over and over, and can we put it online somewhere that people can continue to add to it, and then be it a government entity, private sector, others can decide which of those actions they want to integrate to their work plans next year and moving forward. So that was one step, because I'm always just trying to say, people come to me, we have to do something. I'm like, tell me what you want to see done, and I can see which part of that I can do. So we're always trying to do that. The other thing is, I always ask people to, and these are great sessions that bring different voices together. Again, as a government rep that can sometimes be quite frank and open, that surprises people. And I find there's a lot of people that have assumptions about what government reps are like. I encourage us all to sort of try and break down some of these assumptions, because I do have people that get very cautious about engaging with me, and there's only so much I can do or push forward, and I'm always like, we need other people's ideas to address these ridiculously complex issues. It's not going to be done by government alone. I think everyone knows that, but that actually involves us to have honest conversations with each other.
Yes, thank you so much for that honesty. And I just want to say thank you all to to everyone who is in this room for staying on until now. There's something under your seat for staying on. And secondly, I just want to say thank you to thank you to APC and other organizations who have been working in this area for the for several years, and also to the organizers for this. And you just finalized our conversation. This is not the end of the conversation, but we hope to continue having these conversations, government, civil society activists, academia, and also tech companies. So thank you so much. Yes.
And can I just add my thanks as well, first of all, to all our wonderful panelists. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for giving us ways forward, and thank you for giving us hope, right, that we can make this happen. And two people have really worked hard behind the scenes on this, Jack Esemki and Raquel Gatto. We sincerely thank you. I think you should stand up. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for putting in all that work, all that energy, all that effort to bring it to here. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's hope we don't have to have another gender main session to make things go forward. Let's hope that this generates the kind of energy that we need for gender to really be put at the center of internet governance. Thank you.